It's very exciting to experiment with structure. I think that many stories are best told in some elliptical way or some unusual way. There's only one rule of show business or writing, and that's don't be boring. So anything that you can do that's interesting and novel and keeps an audience engaged, almost anything you can do that's not boring will be successful. Like you could have a story that was just all the beginning. Now, I've never tried that. Just a story that kept having a beginning but never went anywhere. But yet it could have its own ending that would be very experimental, and it couldn't be too long. You could have a story that was just the middle. You could have a story that was just final paragraphs. I've asked my students sometimes to do a story that was just description of the scene, where you're setting the scene very carefully for a story, using really good descriptions and really original metaphors, but then that's the story. The whole story is setting the scene. So that would be experimental. I've seen a story by somebody whose younger brother died of a drug overdose, and they didn't know he was even a drug addict. It was a shock because no one knew he's taking heroin. So he's reported he's dead. So people in the family are so stunned by this, they just keep remembering when they last saw him and did they have any hint? You know, people are always saying, oh, we had no hint. When people commit suicide, everyone said, I had no idea, or, well, I might have had an idea, or it's my fault, I didn't help, or I didn't know what I could have done. All these thoughts lend themselves to a kind of like question and answer. You could have a whole story that was a questionnaire. I probably have done that, you know, a question, like question and answer. Okay, that'd be a nice story for a writer who wants to experiment. A story in a question and answer mode. Another story could be just answers. I once wrote a story that was answers, like the question you don't see. You just see the answers, and that was fun to do. So I recommend for any story that you have, that you like, that you're haunted by, to find some unusual way of telling it. Some experimental writers like Donald Barth and Robert Coover and John Barth have done all sorts of wild things. I once wrote a short story that was just notes to contributors. You know, at the end of a magazine, I have notes on contributors. So my story was called Notes on Contributors, and it was in the magazine. So when people who read the magazine thought that was the notes of the contributors, but it really wasn't. It was a short story, but anybody could do that. I mean, that's something that somebody else could try. Notes on contributors. I think it would be really great for a new writer or young writer to say to herself or himself, I'm going to write a series of prose works so original and novel that there's no name for what they are. And somebody will say, well, is it prose? Is it poetry? Is it work of art? And each story will be in the form of some interesting shape that no one's ever done before. Because to do something that no one's ever done before is really quite an accomplishment. So that's a challenge. Some time ago in my own life, I was very interested in experimental music. And there are piano pieces by Henry Cowell, who lived in the early 20th century. And I'm not sure that I was trying to play these piano pieces, but I was listening to them on recordings. And Henry Cowell had this really wonderful, weird, eerie technique of opening the piano and playing the strings of the piano. And when you play the piano in that way with the strings, it's very ghostly and strange sounding. It sounds like the piano, but it's different. And there's no resonance. Like when you're playing piano, usually you're using a pedal, so there's a little memory, the resonance of the music and the vibrations continue. But with Henry Cowell, everything was kind of broken. And so it was discontinuous in a very exciting way. So I had the idea to write a story that would mimic that structure. So the story would have these floating paragraphs, like the chords of a piece of music. And each little paragraph would be very small and just have a fact. Each fact, and then some paragraphs got longer. The title of the story is Heat. So it was midsummer, the heat rippling above macadam roads, cicadas screaming out of the trees, and the sky like pewter glaring. So I worked on that first paragraph for a while with the commas. And the sky like pewter, comma, glaring. That seemed important to me. So I had that first paragraph. And then the second paragraph, the days were the same day, like the shallow mud-brown river moving always in the same direction, but so low you couldn't see it. Except for Sunday, every day is the same day. Then church in the morning, then the Sunday newspaper, the color comics, and newsprint on your fingers. So when I got to the second paragraph, the word you came up. So now it seems that somebody's remembering something. The days were the same day. There'd be church in the morning on Sunday, the newspaper, the comics. So that suggests that these are children in this world, and the newsprint on your fingers, which is something I remember. So then the third paragraph, I introduced Rhea and Rhoda Kunkel. So now there are two girls. Now we don't know how old they are, but they're flying on their rusted old bicycles down the long hill toward the railroad yard, Whipple's Ice, the scrubby pasture land where dairy cows grazed. They'd stolen $6 from their own grandmother who loved them. They were 11 years old. They were identical twins. They bask in their power. So the third paragraph is not necessarily related to the others. It's like this Henry Cowell music that is kind of floating. And then the fourth paragraph is out of time. It's a sort of an observation from the future. Rita and Rhoda Kunkel. It was always Rhea and Rhoda, never Rhoda and Rhea. I don't know why. You just couldn't say the names that way. Not even the teachers at school would say them that way. So there seems to be some girl classmate of theirs remembering them, but she doesn't know too much about what she's saying. Then the fifth paragraph, we went to see them in the funeral parlor where they were waked. We were made to. So by the fifth paragraph, we see they're already dead. Rhea and Rhoda, we saw them on their bicycles, but by the fifth paragraph, they're dead already. We were made to go see them in the funeral parlor. We were made to, meaning we were children and we had to do it. Our parents made us. The twins in twin caskets, white, smooth, gleaming, perfect as plastic, with white satin lining puckered like the inside of a fancy candy box. And the waxy white lilies and the smell of talcum powder and perfume. The room was crowded. There was only one way in and one way out. So that paragraph is packed with a lot of meaning. We see that the girls are dead, and they're in this very plastic-looking situation with white, like a candy box, and waxy lilies and the smell of talcum powder. And the room is crowded. There's only one way in and one way out. This suggests like there's one way into our lives and there's one way out. And the children are made to go in the funeral parlor. Then the next paragraph, Rhea and Rhoda were the same girl. They'd wanted it that way. Only looking from one to the other could you see they were two. This is a child speaking in kind of illogical, almost like a comic voice. They were the same girl, meaning they looked identical. They were twins. They wanted to look identical, but you have to look from one to the other quickly to see that they were two. Try to figure out which is Rhea and which is Rhoda. But the person who's saying this is childish, and so her method of speaking is a little bit naive. Then the next paragraph is out of time. It's some different time. The heat was gauzy. You had to push your way through it like swimming. On their bicycles, Rhea and Rhoda flew through it, hardly noticing, from their grandmother's place on Main Street to the end of South Main, where the paved road turned to gravel, leaving town. This was the summer before 7th grade when they died. Death was coming for them, but they didn't know. So the whole story proceeds in these paragraphs that are cutting back and forth in time, and we get introduced to other people, and you're introduced to their murderer. The murderer is introduced very soon. It's said that he's arrested before we know who he is, because the girl who's remembering the story remembers it in a discontinuous way, which is the way our memories work. The whole story was imagined as this experiment in paragraphs. And so I just started writing it, and I wrote the paragraphs in no particular order, the way a child might remember them. If you were remembering somebody you knew in grade school, so somebody you knew in 7th grade and this person died, you have a discontinuous memory. Like you remember, you remember the first time you met the girl. You might remember the girl with her mother. You might remember the girl who's already dead. You remember how she died. You remember thoughts about her. You remember something that she did. None of it's continuous, because our memories are very broken and fragmented. Nobody has a chronological memory. All our memories are just sort of like ripples in the pond, and they're very discontinuous, but they're very, it's very exciting that way because there's a certain delayed continuity. The chronology is definite. Something happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The chronology is very clear, but the memory of it is discontinuous. So for me, it was very exciting to write it, because once in a while the girl, she thinks, well, death is coming for you, but you don't know when. And suddenly she thinks that's true for her too. You know, when you're a child, you don't think that death is coming for you. When you get older, you do. I think that we become ghosts in our own pasts, and there are certain places that we haunt in our memories. We keep going back to those places and looking at them again. And the idea of the girls on the bicycle is something that is very haunting to me. If you're a writer, you want to find something that's haunting to you, something you may remember, but not completely. You remember parts of it. There's a very famous short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman called The Yellow Wallpaper that people probably know. I recommend that story. But that's all just sentences and almost no paragraphs. And that story is written from the point of view of a woman who's suffering a nervous breakdown. She's been put in a room at the top of a house that almost feels like she's been put away, like her own family's put her in an asylum, like her husband's put her up in that room. And that story, when you look at it, is very manic. She's manic. The sentences are like machine gun fire. She's in a manic state all the way through. She's breathless. And when you look at that story as a typological phenomenon, you really want to read it. Now, there are other stories and other prose where it's all one paragraph, and there have been novels that are all one paragraph. They represent a certain challenge to the brain, because we like continuity. We like continuity and discontinuity. We like continuity to end. We like finite things. We like minutes lead to hours, and hours end. Hours lead to a day, and that ends. And you cross off that, and then it leads up to a month, and you cross off the month, and then we have a year. Now, in nature, there are seasons, but there are not these finite things. You know, birds and animals have no sense of what the chronology is. But there's something about the human brain that likes things to be finite. So you like something to come to an end. And when it's all one paragraph, like a long novel, that's a challenge. It's a challenge. Your readership diminishes. You don't have as many people read it. A typical Stephen King novel moves very swiftly. And all the novels, probably every novel that's a bestseller ever, is something that moves pretty fast, and some of the sentences are are pretty short in the declarative sentences. I wanted to write a story that was about a maze. And as you go around the maze, you get farther and farther till you're in the middle. And it might have been something called The Maze or The Captive. So the story has sentences all around, like in a large type, all around. So you read it like this. And then the next line in is slightly smaller font. So you're going in, and that's slightly smaller. So you keep going around and around with slightly smaller font until it gets way, way, way in. Then in the middle, there's like a rectangle that ends with like 2 words and a period. So the idea is that some person has gone through this whole maze and ends up in the middle. And it was printed in a magazine. So you had to keep turning the magazine around. And so I was pasting things in, and then I photocopied it. So it became more like a work of art. But I would like to experiment with something like that again. And I should encourage my students to do that kind of typological experimentation. There's a whole kind of poetry, that like a poem in the shape of a tree, a poem in the shape of a key, a poem of the shape of a bird. I've tried to write poems in different shapes, like the shape of a tree with a little thing on the bottom. Those are very interesting because they acknowledge the fact that's neurological, that art comes to us through our eyes. So art and literature come to us through our eyes, and you can do things with the white space that's very arresting. If I were an editor, I used to be an editor. If I got a short story that had different typography and different shapes and fonts, I would read that story with more interest than a conventional story. I would find that very exciting visually, and I would hope that I could publish it. There may be other editors who feel that way. But most stories that come in are just conventional. So I would like to do more unusual things like that. So as I think more about it, maybe I'll go home and write some of these strange stories.